All right, let's talk about housing then. And no, since you've become Premier, you have made housing a priority. You were focusing on renters at the weekend. And I want to ask you about those policies that you announced in terms of timeline, but also I want to ask you in the context of Anthony Albanese's reshuffle at the weekend. Do you think what he's done with putting Claire O'Neill essentially in charge of housing there has changed a little bit of emphasis for him? Have you noted a shift from the federal government about their priorities?
Well, look, I haven't necessarily noticed a shift other than it needs to be a priority for federal and state governments. Housing in particular is the biggest cost for everybody. It's one of the leading drivers of inflation in the economy. Yeah. It's a crisis, particularly in Sydney, which just a couple of weeks ago was noted as the second most expensive city in the world. So we want to work with anyone and everybody to get some kind of relief for renters, for those that have a mortgage, because we're living in a city that runs the risk of not having any grandchildren when we're losing twice as many young people as we're getting in.
So what's your view on, this great Australian dream of home ownership? Do you tell young people today that that is still achievable, or, do you back in what the Property Council and others want to see more of, and that is build to rent properties? Is that perhaps the new reality for this next generation?
I don't think there's a one-size-fits-all. Ultimately, we, as a state government, are responsible for more supply, which is going to help both people that want to ultimately buy a property and those that are happy to or have to rent as an alternative. And we're not doing enough of that, and as a result, it's putting major pressures on both the ability to buy a house and the ability to rent one. But I just make the point, when I was young, say 20 years ago, the question asked was, would I ever be able to afford to buy a place? Now young people ask whether they'll even be able to afford to rent one. And when you travel around Sydney on the weekends and you see 120 people waiting for an open house, and you've got young people like we had today at a media conference where one was a pilot and one worked at education, and they were getting kicked out of their rental properties as well, something's got to change here, or we're going to lose an entire generation, our best and brightest, to other states, other cities, other countries at New South Wales' expense.
Yeah, the housing crisis is just one example of huge cost of living pressures. We have new data today that shows that businesses, particularly hospitality and retail, are closing. They're folding at a rapid rate. This is just the latest data in a long line of pieces of data that point to big problems for small businesses in particular. It's getting harder and harder to make a living. New South Wales, of course, and particularly in Sydney, super expensive. Is this something that's on your radar, and what can be done about it?
Yeah, massively. It's the biggest challenge, both the twin hits of both inflation and interest rates, smashing household budgets, something that we haven't seen in Australia for decades. One of the reasons we've made our changes to renters in New South Wales is, yes, of course, for young people, yes, of course, for the 2 million renters, but also for the economy. There's not a single business I have spoken to in the last year and a half that hasn't told me that it's almost impossible to get skilled labour, and the pressures on labour costs are massive. The major reason for that, Laura, is access to housing. If you offer a pay increase, but the vast majority of it is going to be eaten up because of a rent increase or a mortgage increase, then you're behind the 8 ball already, and that's why we've acted in the last day and certainly over the last 6 months to reform planning, to build more social housing, but also these much needed common sense changes to rents, because as I said earlier, a city without young people is a city without a future.